Hi, everyone. My name is George Kalu. I am going to be your instructor for Bio 7, Human Anatomy. This class will be a hybrid course. So it'll be, the lectures will have pre-recorded lectures that will be posted onto Canvas. You can watch those at your own leisure. And then the labs will be Monday, Wednesday, scheduled from 6 to 9:05 p.m. And those will be hosted on the Gavilan College campus in room 103. All right. So I'll do a more formal introduction to myself in lab when we first meet. But just for the sake of keeping this video short, we're just going to go ahead and get into this first chapter here. So our first chapter is going to be on an introduction to the human body. So this is our textbook here, Principles of Human Anatomy by Tortora. We'll be using this throughout the semester. So this chapter is an introduction to anatomy. It kind of jumps all over the place. I'll try to keep the flow as smooth as possible, but there are going to be times where we're going to be kind of jumping around from one topic to the next. So just bear with me for that. It'll go a lot smoother after this chapter. Okay, here's the learning objectives. I'll let you guys go ahead and read that on your own time, but we're basically just going to be going over the uh, defining what anatomy and physiology are. We're going to be looking at what makes certain things alive. We're going to be looking at anatomical position. We're going to be looking at different types of planes and sections through the human body and exploring different body cavities. And then we're also going to be relating all of this um, to a clinical side of it. So looking at symptoms and signs of diseases and things like that. Okay. All right. So intro to the human body. So first off, we're an anatomy class, so we're going to learn what is anatomy. So anatomy is the study of the uh, structure of different things and the relationships between those structures. Okay? And so in order to really fully understand how to understand the anatomy, we have to go through dissections. And so a dissection is where we cut apart different parts of the body so that we can study it and look at how all the structures are put together and what they all do. Okay. So that's one way that we're able to do that in, a lab setting through dissection. But we can also use imaging techniques, and we'll look at that towards the end of the PowerPoint. Okay, so anatomy is the study of the structures and the relationships between those structures. Anatomy goes really hand in hand with physiology. And so physiology is the study of how those structures function. Okay, how do they work? And why do they work the way that they do? Some of those functions are going to be pretty obvious. Some of them are going to be a lot more subtle. So, just like anything in biology, we're going to study anatomy and physiology from the cellular level all the way up to the macroscopic level. So here we have an example of a skull. And so if we wanted to study the anatomy, we could study, how is the parietal bone articulated or joined with the temporal bone? And what's their relationship to the frontal bone? What's their relationship to the occipital bone? And learning about how they're structured and how they're put together. Uh, the physiology component of this would be what's the function of each of these things? Why do they work the way they do? What is it that they do? And so the main structure of the skull as a whole is to protect the brain. And so those would be pretty simplistic explanations of anatomy and physiology, but obviously these can get a lot more nitty-gritty, and we'll explore that as the semester goes on. Okay, so looking at how the body's organized, it's going to be organized from from the chemical level all the way up to the organismal level. Okay, so the first level that we're going to have here is the chemical level, and that's going to be where we see our atoms, and those atoms are going to join together to form molecules. Okay, so when you have multiple atoms together, we're forming a molecule. The next thing that's going to happen is those molecules are going to come together, and those molecules are going to join together to form a cell. And so the cell is the basic structural and functional unit of any organism. Okay. Now, when you have multiple cells put together, each of these cells will come together to form a tissue. Okay. And so we have multiple types of tissues. We'll look at those next week. But we can have tissues like epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, things like that. Now, when you have multiple different types of tissues all coming together to form another structure, we're going to have what's called an organ. Okay, so multiple tissues come together to form an organ. So here we have the stomach. The stomach is going to be made up of muscle tissue. It's going to be made up of epithelial tissue and connective tissue, as well as some nervous tissue. All of those are going to come together to form a specific function of that particular organ. And again, we'll talk about tissues next week. Now, when we take multiple organs that all work together to accomplish a certain goal, those organs that work together are form what's called an organ system. And so here we have the example of the digestive system. We have the intestines, we have the stomach, we have the liver, we have the esophagus, we have the mouth, we're going to have the anus. All of those are going to work together to help us digest food, absorb nutrients, and then get rid of the waste that we don't need anymore. Okay? And the last thing is when we have multiple different organ systems all working together, that is going to help us form our organism, or the human in this case, okay, in our case. Okay, so here, quick question for you guys. So which of the following are the smallest functional units in the body? Take a second to answer this to yourself. And the answer to this would be a cell. Yeah, another question. So a system in the body is composed of related blank with a common function. Okay, take a second. Pause it if you need to. Pause the video if you need to. And so the answer to this would be an organ. Okay, so a system is going to be made up of multiple different organ systems, or sorry, multiple different organs with a common function. Okay, so let's look at the different types of systems that we can have. And we're going to be exploring all of these throughout the semester. So first organ system is the integumentary system. It's going to be made up of our skin, our hair, and our nails. Okay. Next, we got our skeletal system, which is made up of our bones, joints, cartilage. We have muscular tissue, which is made up of our muscle and tendons and ligaments. We have our cardiovascular system, which is going to be made up of our heart, our arteries, veins, capillaries. We have our lymphatic system, which we're probably not going to get a chance to touch on this semester, but it's going to be made up of the spleen, the lymph nodes, a lot of white blood cells, the bone marrow as well. We have nervous tissue, and so that is going to be made up of the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. We have endocrine tissue or endocrine systems, and that's going to be made up of different glands throughout the body. So the pancreas, for example, the adrenal glands, the thyroid, the testes. We have the respiratory system, and that's going to be all the organs that help us to breathe. So the lungs, the trachea, the pharynx, larynx, nasal cavity, oral cavity. We have the digestive system, which we talked about earlier. We have the urinary system, which is made up of the kidneys, the ureter, and the bladder, and the urethra. And then we have the reproductive system, which is going to be made up of the penis for the men and the testes, as well as several other smaller components, as well as the uterus, the uterine tubes, the ovaries, and several other structures, the vagina as well for the woman. Okay. So now, shifting gears here, we're going to talk about life processes. So what makes something alive? There's 6 different components that are going to be that we're going to be looking at in order to consider whether something is alive. The first thing is metabolism. Okay, so metabolism is just a bunch of chemical processes that occur within the body. Now, these processes are going to be either used to help break down certain things. Okay, so like for example, when we're eating, our metabolism is going to help to break down the food into different nutrients that our body can use to give itself energy, or we can build different molecules. So for example, when we're working out and we're at the gym, we're going to be building up our muscles. So both of those are examples of metabolism. So one thing that an organism has to be able to do is it has to be able to break down or build up different molecules. Okay? That's number one. Number two is that it has to be responsive. It has to be able to detect changes in the environment, and then it has to be able to respond to those changes appropriately in order to help it not just live, but also survive. So for example, if it's hot outside, what are we going to do? We're going to, our body's going to sweat, and that's going to help to cool our bodies down. Okay. So next thing that's going to do is it has to be able to move. And this can refer to the organ as a whole. It can refer to different cells within the organ. It refers to organelles or the organs, but it has to be able to move in some capacity. Yeah, that was pretty self-explanatory. Growth. So the body has to be able to grow, whether it's a plant, it's got to be able to grow from a seed into a tree, or a flower, whatever case it may be. If it's a human, it's got to be able to go from a baby to to an adult. Okay. Differentiation is the fifth one. And so differentiation is a very interesting process where we take cells that are unspecialized, which means that these cells can become anything. These cells can become muscle cells, they can become brain cells, they can become blood cells, but they can become anything. And those unspecialized cells have to become specialized. So those unspecialized cells are what we refer to as stem cells. So we'll talk about that briefly down the road. Okay, so they have to become specialized into specific cells. They're going to become something and have a special, specific function. Okay. And the last thing is going to be reproduction. Okay, so it's got to be able to reproduce in two ways. The first way is that it has to be able to grow, repair, or replace itself, or replace different cells, I should say. So, for example, our cells are constantly going to be dividing in order to help us, maintain functions throughout the body, or if a cell starts to fall apart, it's not working very well, it's got to be able to repair itself or create a new cell to take its place in order to keep the organ and organism functioning. Or it's got to be able to reproduce as a whole. So, obviously we're going to have offspring that are going to be needed in order to create the next generation of organisms or species. Okay, so now shifting gears again. Sorry, I told you there's going to be a lot of shifting gears here. So if I told you the wrist is above your fingers, is that true or false? So if you think about it, it kind of depends on what your answer or on your positioning, right? So if I'm standing with my hands down at my sides, the wrist is technically going to be above my fingers. But if I'm standing with my hands up, then now the wrist is below my fingers. So this creates a bit of confusion. Okay? And we don't like confusion in anatomy. We don't like confusion in medicine. We want to be as specific and clear with our descriptions as possible. So this can create problems if we're not very clear about what our relationships to different body parts are. Okay. So what anatomists have done is they created what's called the anatomical position. So the anatomical position is a standard position of reference when you're talking about anatomical structures. Okay. And they also have regional names and directional terms, which we'll look at here on the next slide. Okay. So here we're first looking at anatomical position. So in anatomical position, we're looking at all four of these green circles here. Okay, we're going to have the body facing forward with the eyes facing forward as well. We're going to have the hands facing, or the palms of the hands facing forward. Okay, that is key. That is really important. And then we're going to have the knees, or the legs and the feet also facing forward and being parallel. Okay, parallel and in line with each other. So if you're in a lunge, you're not in anatomical position because your legs are not specifically parallel with one another. Okay. If you're standing with your hands up, you're not in anatomical position because your hands need to be down at your sides, palms facing forward. Okay. If your palms are facing backward, again, not in anatomical position. So all four of these traits need to be present for you to be considered an anatomical position. Okay. Body facing forward, eyes facing forward, palms of the hands facing forward, legs parallel and facing forward. Okay. Now we also have regional terms. Okay? So these regional terms are going to help us determine, what structures are in different parts of the body or what parts of the body we're talking about. Okay. So for the cephalic region is going to be referred to as the head. Okay. The neck region, the anatomical term for that is the cervical region. Okay. The trunk is made up of the chest, the abdomen, and the pelvis. The upper limb refers to the shoulders all the way down to your fingers, okay, so your entire arm. And then the lower limb is everything that you would consist of your hips and your legs, okay? So everything from your hips all the way down to your toes. Okay? So be comfortable with these regional terms because they're going to be really important to help us discuss different structures as we go forward in this class. Okay. So we also have two other body positions. And so these positions are called prone and supine. So prone is when you have someone's someone's facing down. Okay, they're face down. And then we also have supine. Okay, supine is when the body's facing up or they're face up. Okay, so the way I remember that is supine is when they're lying on their spine. Okay, supine, lying on the spine. So they're going to be face up. All right. So again, now shifting gears here. So now we're going to be looking at different planes through the body. So the planes are going to be these imaginary surfaces or imaginary, planes that are going to be passing through the body in different ways. Okay, and we'll see why this is going to be important in a second here. So we have four different planes that we can have. The first plane is called a sagittal plane. So a sagittal plane comes from the top down, is a vertical plane that separates the body into the left and right sides. Okay. Now within that, you can have what's called a mid-sagittal plane. And so the mid-sagittal will cut directly right in the middle, so you have equal left and right sides, or a parasagittal where you cut off center. And so you have unequal sides. Okay, one side is bigger than the other, but it's still going to separate the body to left and right. Okay. The next plane that we can have is a frontal, or also called a coronal plane. And so the coronal plane is also vertical, and that will go through, again, the top all the way down to the bottom of the body. Okay. And that will separate the front and the back sides of the body. Okay. Next, we have transverse. And so a transverse plane is going to separate the body into top and bottom portions, or upper and lower portions here. And then we have an oblique plane, and that's going to cut something at a non-right angle. Okay. So all of these other planes that we were talking about, the first three, sagittal, frontal, transverse, these all cut at perpendicular or parallel, perpendicular planes at 90-degree angles. Okay. Oblique does not. It's going to cut at some other angle that's not 90 degrees. Okay. Now, this is important because as we cut through and we're dissecting different organs, we're going to get different views depending on what plane we're cutting our organ through. So when you cut an organ, or when you're dissecting an organ through a specific plane, that piece of organ you're talking about now is called a section. So this would be referred to as a mid-sagittal section of the brain. Here we'd have a frontal section of the brain, and here's a transverse section of the brain. Okay. So this is really important because depending on the different plane that you use to cut your organ, you're going to get a different view, and you're going to see different structures within that organ. Okay, so question for you guys. So which of the anatomical planes listed below are vertical? Okay, so we have 1, frontal, 2, mid-sagittal, 3, oblique, 4, parasagittal, 5, transverse. Okay, which ones are vertical planes? Okay, so you should have said 1, 2, and 4. 1 is a frontal plane, again, going up and down, okay, separating front and back. Mid-sagittal, going up and down, separating left and right. Parasagittal is also, again, going up and down, but it's off-center, but still separating left and right. Okay. Now, we have dissected a kidney here. So what cut or what section of the kidney is this? So take a second to think about this. So you should have answered a frontal section. Well, this question typically trips people up a couple times because it's easy to think, okay, well, we're cutting this into left and right sides. We're opening it up like a book, but that's not what sagittal means. Sagittal means you're cutting it directly right down the middle, separating left and right sides. The kidneys, again, you have to consider this in anatomical position. So with the kidneys, when they're in anatomical position, look like this. Okay, they're organized like this. So when you cut through it in this way, you're actually making a frontal cut of that kidney a frontal cut through this kidney. Okay. All right, so now shifting gears again here. So now we have directional terms, and these directional terms are also really important to understand because this is going to help us determine what we're talking about and determine relationships between different structures, different organs, and where they are in relation to one another. It looks like a lot, and it kind of is a lot, but it's kind of not. A lot of these are in pairs, and so if you understand one, it's easy to understand the other. And so we'll go through all of this And this will all make sense. And we'll talk about it more in lab next week. Okay. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to discuss how we kind of phrase all of these relationships. Okay. So we say one body part is insert directional term to the next body part. Okay. So I'll give you an example here. So the first one is superior versus inferior. Okay. Superior means towards the head or above. Inferior means below or towards the feet. Okay. But you don't use this for limbs. We'll talk about what you use for limbs. Okay. So this is used for everything else, but not your arms or your legs. So for example, you would say the head, body part, is superior, directional term, to the neck. Okay. The head is superior to the neck. The head is above the neck. Okay. Likewise, you can also reverse this. So you could say the neck is inferior to the head. Okay. The neck is below the head. Okay. Cranial and caudal are kind of used similarly. Usually use this with animals, but just for the sake of completion, kind of work the same. Okay. Cranial just means towards the head. Caudal towards the tail. We probably won't use that too much. We'll usually use superior versus inferior, but again, just so that you're at least aware. Okay. The next one that we use is rostral. So rostral just means towards the face. Okay. So again, this is only used with structures within the face or within the head area. Okay. So for example, you can say the eyes are rostral to the brain. Okay. The eyes are closer to the face than the brain. Okay. Then the next one that we have is anterior or ventral. Okay, these two mean the same thing, versus posterior and dorsal. Okay, these two mean the same thing. Okay, so anterior and posterior, they go together. Ventral and dorsal, they go together. Okay, or they're opposites, I should say. So anterior and ventral, they mean towards the front of the body. Okay, posterior or dorsal means towards the back of the body. Okay, so you can think of like a fish's dorsal fin. A dorsal fin is going to be on the back. Okay, post usually means back. So posterior, dorsal, close to the back. So for example, you could say the heart is anterior to the spine. Okay? The heart is going to be closer to the front of the body than the spine is. Okay. All right. So now we have medial versus lateral. Okay. Medial just means closer to the midline. Lateral means farther away from the midline. Okay. So for example, I could say the heart is medial to the shoulders. Okay. The heart is going to be closer to the midline than the shoulders are, or vice versa. The shoulders are lateral to the heart, or the lungs are lateral to the heart. Okay. The next one that we have here is intermediate versus ipsilateral and versus contralateral. Okay. So intermediate just means in between two structures. Okay. So for example, you could say the heart is intermediate to both lungs. Okay. The heart is in between the two lungs. Okay. Ipsilateral means on the same side. Okay. So ipsi means same. So you could say, the left shoulder is ipsilateral to the left hip, or you could say, the right shoulder is ipsilateral to the right hip. Contralateral means opposite. Okay. The opposite side of the midline. Okay. So you could say the left shoulder is contralateral to the right hip. Okay. So contradicting is like doing the opposite of what you normally do. Contralateral is the opposite side. All right. Now we have proximal and distal. So proximal and distal are only used for your limbs. Okay. These are only used for your arms and your legs. Okay. So the textbook definition of this is for proximal, it's near the attachment of the limb. Okay. That's just a fancy way of saying, for example, closer to the shoulder. Okay. Wherever the arm attaches to the trunk of the body. So the arm attaches to the trunk via the shoulder, the legs attach to the trunk via the hips. Okay. So anything that's proximal is going to be closer to that attachment point, close to the trunk. Okay. In this case, the shoulder or the hip. Distal means further away from that attachment point. Okay. So for example, you could say the elbow is proximal to the wrist. Okay. So it doesn't matter whether my hands are up or down, the elbow will always be closer to the shoulder than my wrist is. Okay. If I have my hands up like this, elbow's closer to my shoulder. If my hands are down, elbow is still closer to my shoulder. Okay. So that's why it's really important to have these directional terms, because if you don't, things get a little bit muddled in your descriptions here. Okay. Likewise, you can also say, my ankles are distal to my knees. Okay. Your ankles are farther from your hips, your attachment point, than your knees are. Okay. So ankles are distal to the knees. Okay. Good. All right. So we just went through the majority of these directional terms in just those couple slides. Okay. So this is just a slide for your reference, just to help you kind of clarify what everything is. So again, proximal is going to be closer to the attachment point to the trunk, in this case, your shoulder or your hips. And distal is going to be further away. Use your midline, which is going to be right down the middle of your body, right down the center. Medial is going to be closer to the midline. Lateral is going to be away from the midline on either side. Okay. All right. Last couple terms here. Superficial versus deep. So superficial just means towards the surface of their body or towards the skin. Deep means away from the body or towards the inside of your body. Okay. So for example, you could say the skin is superficial uh, to the heart, or you could say the ribs are superficial to the intestines. The ribs are going to be closer to the surface of your body than your intestines would be. Okay. Or vice versa. For deep, you could say the heart is deep to the sternum. Okay. Your sternum is going to be closer to the surface of your body. The heart's going to be deeper inside. So the heart is deep to the sternum. And then the last one is external versus internal. This is referred to individual organs, okay, or individual structures. So you can say the heart valves, for example, are internal to the myocardium, which is the muscle of the heart. Okay. So those are all the directional terms. We'll take some time to try to get familiar with that a little bit, and then we will clarify those a little bit more in lab and really delve into that. Okay. But we're going to make sure that this is really clear before we go forward with the rest of our class. Okay, so question for you guys here. So in the figure shown, the carpals are blank to the humerus. Okay, so here are your carpals down here. Okay, your humerus is your upper arm bone. Okay, so what would be the correct directional term? Take a second. So the answer would be distal. So the carpals are distal to the humerus. They're further away from the attachment point than your humerus is. Okay. And again, you can't use superior here or inferior because we're talking about a limb. You're talking about your arms. It's not proximal. Proximal would be the opposite. So you could say the humerus is proximal to the carpals. And then anterior and posterior don't fit here just because they're all on the same line. Yeah. Okay. Next question. So when the human body is in anatomical position, the palm of the hand faces A, forward, B, laterally, C, medially, D, posteriorly, or E, superiorly. So the answer to this would be forward, and I will let you guys try to figure out what directional term that refers to. Okay. So forward hand would be what directional term? Think about that. We'll talk about it on Monday. All right. So next topic we're going to be bouncing around to is the body cavities. Okay. So what are cavities? Cavities are just spaces in the body that are going to be holding different organs, different internal organs. And these cavities are going to be separated from each other by different bones, muscles, ligaments, and things of that nature. Okay. So we've got three main cavities in the body. The first one is the cranial cavity. The cranial cavity refers to the brain, holds the brain, it holds the vertebral canal, and it holds the meninges. Okay. So even though this is referred to as the cranial cavity, which we think of as our head, okay, the cranial cavity actually holds the structures in the head as well as the structures in the spine. Okay. So that's one thing to make sure we keep clear. The second cavity that we have is the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity holds the ribs, the chest muscles, the sternum, and the thoracic vertebrae. Okay? And so within that thoracic cavity, we have two other cavities. One is the pericardial cavity, which is the cavity that holds the heart, okay, the cavity that surrounds the heart. We also have two pleural cavities, which surround the lungs, okay? So if we're going to be up here on our chest, we're going to have the heart and the lungs in the thoracic cavity. We also have a region called the mediastinum or mediastinum, depending on how you want to say it. And that's going to be the region in between the medial walls of the pleura. Okay. And that's going to contain all of the thoracic organs except for the lungs. And we'll talk about what those are in a second. Okay. The last cavity is the abdominopelvic cavity. Okay. And that's going to hold everything from the diaphragm, which is what separates your chest from your abdomen. Okay. Your diaphragm all the way down into the groin. Okay. So the abdominopelvic cavity is going to be made up of your abdominal and your pelvic cavities. Okay. So here's a quick picture that kind of shows the quick breakdown of where everything is. So here's your cranial cavity. Cranial cavity again is going to hold the head as well as the skull, as well as the vertebrae. Okay, all coming down, and the meninges surrounding that. And again, we'll talk about all those down the line. Okay, we also have the thoracic cavity here in blue. That's going to hold your chest cavity. It's going to hold heart and the lungs. And then it's also going to hold all those organs that are also there. So the esophagus, the trachea, as they come down, they're going to be in the chest cavity. Some large blood vessels. Okay, so those are all going to be housed within the thoracic cavity. And then the last one is the abdominopelvic cavity. And so that's going to be separated into the abdominal cavity here and the pelvic cavity down here. Okay. So this is what these cavities would look like in a cadaver. And so we'll get to see a cadaver throughout the semester. But again, here we see the cranial cavity with the brain and the spinal cord coming down here and the vertebral canal. We have the thoracic cavity, which is going to hold heart, lungs, major blood vessels, and then here is the trachea. And then the last one is the abdominopelvic cavity, where we're going to have a lot of our abdominal organs, our intestines, and then the pelvic organs, which is going to be made up of the uterus, bladder, ureters. All that stuff is going to be down in the pelvic cavity. All right. Okay, so now within the thoracic and abdominal cavities, we have membranes. And these membranes are going to be these very thin, very flexible, pliable tissues that are going to cover and line and separate or even connect different structures together. Okay, so one of the most important membranes that we have is called the serous membrane. The serous membrane is associated with a lot of the body cavities, and it's broken up into kind of three components. The first component is the parietal layer. Okay, the parietal layer lines the perimeter of that cavity. Okay, so think parietal, think perimeter. Okay, parietal and perimeter. Okay, it's going to line the perimeter, line the walls of that cavity. Okay, then we also have a visceral layer. The visceral layer is going to directly adhere, or it's going to sit right on top of the organ itself. Okay, that's why we call those organs the viscera. Okay, or your visceral organs. Okay, they're going to be lined by the viscera. Okay, so what's important to remember is that the parietal layer and the visceral layer are the same. The only thing that's different is where they're found. And I'll show you a picture in a second that kind of helps to clarify what I'm saying there. Okay, it's the same layer of tissue. The difference is where exactly it is in relation to the organ. Okay, and I'll show you a picture on the next few slides. Okay, in between the parietal and visceral layers, we have a fluid called the serous fluid. Okay? So the serous fluid is a kind of a lubricative type fluid that helps organs to be able to rub against each other without causing different abrasions against each other. Okay, it allows them to be able to slide across each other nice and smooth without damaging anything. Okay, so let's take a look at what this looks like. So with the lungs, okay, we're going to have a parietal pleura. The parietal pleura is going to line the chest wall. And then that pleura is also going to, or we're also going to have some pleura that's going to line the lungs themselves. And so we call that the visceral pleura. Okay, so again, parietal pleura is going to line the perimeter of the chest wall. The visceral pleura is going to line the lungs themselves. Okay. Then we have the heart. Heart's going to have the serous membrane for the heart is referred to as pericardium. Okay. So visceral pericardium is going to be the lining, the membrane that's going to line the heart. Okay. The parietal pericardium is going to line the pericardium around the heart, okay, the area around the heart. Okay. We also have the peritoneum. Okay, so the peritoneum is going to be found in the abdomen. Okay, the peritoneum just refers to abdominal structures. Okay, so again, we're going to have a visceral peritoneum. A visceral peritoneum is going to be the membrane that lines all of those visceral organs, like the intestines, the liver, all those things like that. And the parietal peritoneum is going to line the walls of the abdominal cavity, okay, as well as the inferior part of the diaphragm, at the underside of the diaphragm. Okay, so here's an example here. So here we're looking at the parietal pleura. Okay, so here we have the parietal pleura, and that's going to line the chest wall. Okay, these little ovals here, those are cuts through the ribs. Okay, and so just on the underside of that, we're going to have the parietal pleura lining the chest wall. Okay, all right here. Okay, then we have the visceral pleura. The visceral pleura is going to line the organ itself. Okay, now in between the visceral and parietal pleura, you're going to have the pleural cavity, which is going to be filled with pleural fluid. Okay, so all of this white space here would be filled with pleural fluid. And again, so if the lungs were to rub against the abdominal or the chest wall, it'll be able to easily slide across the chest wall without causing significant damage or abrasions. Okay, so if we're looking at the pericardium, okay, so here we have parietal pericardium. Okay, that is going to line the surface of the pericardial cavity. Okay, then overlying the heart, we have the visceral pericardium, and that's going to line the heart itself. Okay, and again, in between the two, we would have pericardial fluid. Okay, so this is what I was talking about with the parietal and visceral layers all being one layer. The difference is just where you find it. Okay, so imagine taking a balloon and so the balloon represents the membrane. Okay, you shove your fist into that balloon. Okay, the part of the balloon that is overlying your fist would be your visceral pericard or your visceral layer. Okay, your fist representing the organ. Okay, so this would be your visceral layer. Okay, lining your fist. Everything else around that would be referred to as parietal layer. Okay, so again, this is all the same tissue. The only difference is where exactly it's found. Okay, immediately overlying the organ, it's going to be referred to as visceral layer. But once you are no longer overlying the organ and you're now lining the cavity, okay, now this is referred to as the parietal layer. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Again, we'll clarify that more if there's still confusion on that on Monday. Okay, so now we have the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, so we have two methods of dividing up the abdominal pelvic cavity. The first one is regions, and that's going to be helpful for organ location. And then we have quadrants, and that's going to be used for helping to describe pain, tumors, injuries, things like that, more clinical things. Okay. So we'll start with looking at abdominal pelvic regions. The abdominal pelvic regions are divided up basically into a tic-tac-toe overlying the abdomen. Okay. The first two lines are referred to as midclavicular lines, which means that they're going to be right in the middle they're going to come down the middle of your clavicles on both sides. Okay, so just medial to each of the nipples. Okay, then the second two lines are going to be called the subcostal line, which is going to be just underneath the ribs, and then one over the transtubercular line. Again, you don't need to know those names. but this is kind of where I always think of this as, the pudge area, um, where you get a little, extra loving, your muffin top area. That's going to be where the last line is. And so we make this into a tic-tac-toe. Okay. So going down the middle first, the top middle part is going to be referred to as the epigastric region. Okay. That's going to be the superior and middle part of this tic-tac-toe square. Okay. This is the epigastric region. Okay. Epi meaning over, gastric meaning stomach. So this is going to be the part that's going to be above the stomach. Okay. Next region is going to be the umbilical region. Okay. The umbilical region is going to be this middle part. That's going to be referring to where your umbilical cord is, or where your umbilicus, which means your belly button, is. Okay. So umbilical is going to be this middle part. And then the last one is the pubic region, okay, which is going to be in the pubic area. Okay. On either side of that, you're going to have the right and left hypochondriac regions on either side of the epigastric region. Okay. On either side of the umbilical regions, you're going to have the left and right lumbar regions. Okay. And on either side of the pubic regions, you're going to have the left and right inguinal regions. Okay. So left hypochondriac, epigastric, right hypochondriac, left lumbar, umbilical, right lumbar, left inguinal, pubic, right inguinal. Right. And so here we're able to see where all of the organs are, in their particular spaces. Okay. So you can see that the liver, for example, it's going to span the right hypochondriac region as well as the epigastric region. Okay. If we're looking for, the appendix, which is down here, the appendix is usually going to be found in the right inguinal region. Okay. So abdominal pelvic regions are used for identifying organ location. Okay. Okay. This is just another picture to kind of clarify that. Okay. Now, the next region that we have is, the next type of description for the abdominal pelvic cavity is the quadrants. Quadrants are real easy. You just make two lines through the abdomen. Okay. And you're going to and the two lines are going to intersect at the belly button. Okay. Right here. And that's going to divide everything into the left upper quadrant, right upper quadrant, left lower quadrant, right lower quadrant. Super easy, super straightforward. Okay. Nothing special there. Okay. So one thing that I want you to think about, and we'll talk about this in lab, is why would you use abdominal pelvic quadrants in certain situations, and why would you use regions in certain situations? So I want you to think about that. We'll talk about that in more detail in lab as well. Okay, so question for you here. So in the figure shown, which abdominal pelvic region contains the urinary bladder? Okay, so here's the bladder down here. Okay, what region would that be? If you said pubic region, you are absolutely right. Great. Okay, last few things here is human body and disease. So obviously anatomy is going to be really useful for helping us study the body, but studying the body is no good if we're not going to apply it. We got to be able to apply this to most easily medicine. Okay, and so when we're looking at disease, and we're going to be looking at different diseases and how they affect the anatomy throughout this course. Okay, so we have disorders and we have diseases. Disorders are any abnormality of the structure and or function. Okay, so anything that's got an abnormality, something that's not working the way it's supposed to or not built the way it's supposed to, that is referred to as a disorder. Okay, now an illness that has specific signs and specific symptoms is what we refer to as a disease. Okay, so what's the difference between a sign and a symptom? A symptom are subjective things that the body or the patient is able to feel. Okay, so for example, that are not obviously apparent to somebody else. So, example, if I see someone, I have nausea or I have headaches, you can't see that I'm having a headache. Okay, I can tell you that I'm having a headache, and you just kind of have to believe me. So that's referred to as a symptom, things that I can feel, but you can't obviously see. Okay, A sign is something that is objective, something that can be measured and something that I can see on you. Okay. So for example, a rash would be a sign. Laceration, a wound, a tumor. Those will all be signs. Okay. Um, Fevers, high blood pressure, those can all be physiologic signs as well. Okay. But again, those are things that we can measure and be able to objectively see. Okay. Epidemiology is just a study of diseases and understanding why, when, and where diseases happen and how they're transmitted. And then diagnoses. A diagnosis is the skill or the science of being able to distinguish one disorder or disease from another. And so, how do we come up with a diagnosis? We use three different things. One is a medical history, so whatever the patient tells you is going on in their past medical history. You can use physical exam, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then you can also use lab tests, blood tests, urine tests, lots of other tests that can be used to help create a diagnosis. Okay, so diagnostic techniques. These are going to be used for the physical exam component of a doctor's visit. Okay, so we have inspection, palpation, auscultation, and percussion. Okay, so inspection is just taking a look, using your eyes to see what's happening or what changes have occurred. Palpation is when you're actually feeling the person's body. So, for example, you might be palpating the lymph nodes to see if the lymph nodes are enlarged. You can feel that with your hands. Okay. Auscultation, fancy word for listening. So you might be listening to someone's heart, someone's lungs. You can listen to someone's bowel sounds using a stethoscope. So that we refer to as auscultating or auscultation. And then percussion is where you're able to tap on the person to see if see what sounds those organs are making. Okay, so some sounds that are going to be more full might be indicative of some things. Some sounds that are going to be more hollow are going to be indicative of other things going on. All right. Then you also have lots of different types of imaging, and this is beyond the scope of our class, but just for the sake of completion here, we have different types of medical imaging. Okay. So we have radiography, so X-rays that you can use. This would be an example of a chest X-ray. Mammograms are an example of an X-ray as well, and these are going to be used to see if you can identify tumors in a woman's breast. You can also use bone density. I always get this word mixed up. Densitometry or a bone scan to see if someone might be developing arthritis. We can use angiograms, which is looking at blood vessels and looking to see if there's any obstructions in the blood vessels, seeing if they're all working properly or seeing how the flow is. We can see a urogram, which is essentially the same thing, but looking to see how the kidneys are operating and if there's any obstructions in the urine flow. This is a barium contrast X-ray, and that's going to help you show how things are moving through the intestines. Okay. MRIs don't use any radiation. They use magnetic waves, and they use different colors to identify how active a certain part of the body is or the cells in that body are. And then a CT scan takes multiple slices through the body as they're lying down, and it will show you all the different organs in that space. Okay. It takes thousands of slices. CCTA, this is used to look at the coronary arteries and the coronary circulation, the blood vessels that supply the heart. We have ultrasounds that use ultrasound waves. These also don't use X-rays, and you can use that most commonly to look at the babies within the mom's womb. But this is also used very commonly in the ER to look at the bowels or look at the abdominal structures. You can look at the eye using an ultrasound to see what structures may be affected when someone comes in for a complaint. PET scans, these use positron emission, and this is well beyond my level of smartness, but this is able to help identify the activity in different parts of the brain or different parts of other organs to see how those cells are operating. Okay, and so the darker bright areas are going to be more active areas. The areas that are not as bright or more blue or green are not as active. Okay. You can also use endoscopies, and so an endoscopy is just a camera that goes through the GI tract in some capacity, either through the mouth or through the anus, to look at the bowels, the intestines. Okay. And then just for the sake of completeness again, in this book, they're going to use a lot of they're going to use the metric system. So uh, just be ready for that. All right. That's all I've got for chapter one. Sorry, it was a lot of jumping around. But that's going to be the worst of it. Okay. All right. So I'll see you guys on Monday. We'll talk more about this, and then we will, if there's any questions, we'll clarify those, and then we'll have our lab that goes along with chapter one on Monday as well. All right. See you then.